lesson we're taking, right?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, you could look, this is where my brain is. It's right here. Hi. Okay.
Okay, a really cool, I know you don't like costumes, but if you like got like a swimmer's cap and you painted it with like a diagram of like rough sections of the brain, that would be really fun.
I was gonna say, my former lab mate actually made instructions for a paper brain hat that you can make. If anybody wants that, we could have a paper, we could learn how to make paper brain hats.
That'd be cool.
So I have a couple of announcements for you today. Hey, if you haven't turned in your forum posts, those are due at 5 o'clock today. Now, I do know that we had somebody who just added the class, and so come and talk to me after class. I will show you how to get to the forum. That is due at 5 o'clock today. If you don't feel comfortable sharing an unethical study with me through that, you can email it to me and I'm totally fine with that. Now, remember that I do not have a hard rule for 5. Get it in as soon as you can. If it's like Saturday, I probably will not take it. So remember to give me an example of an unethical study. And it's okay if you pick the same one that other people have picked. Your quiz has just posted as of this morning. It is only covering chapter 1. Some of it we have covered here in class, but some of it does come from the book. You have until Tuesday at 5 o'clock to take it. You can take it as many times as you want before the deadline. There is no time limit, and I will take your highest score. So if you haven't kept up with the reading, if you have not read chapter 1, this will force you to read the book, and you can use your book and you can use your notes. It's online. I can't stop you. Yeah.
If we use edition 4, is that going to make a difference?
It might, but if that's the case, put a comment on your quiz and I'll take a look at it. I don't think it should be that different, but a previous edition might have some stuff that is a little more outdated compared to the 5th edition. But again, just flag it and let me take a look at it and I'll figure it out, okay? All right, so we only had one more slide left before talking about neuroscience in the brain. Yes.
Since the quiz opens today, are we allowed to take it today?
Yeah. You could have taken it this morning as soon as it popped up, but I mean, I know that some of you are up at midnight. Let's be honest. How many of you were up at 2? How many of you were up at 3? How many of you were up at 4? Did anybody not sleep tonight? No judgment. I was a college student too. I was in bed by 11:15, and technically I was in bed by like 10:40, but I read for like half an hour on my phone before I go to bed. And you're technically not supposed to do that, but I do it.
Everyone does.
Well, I didn't sleep very well the night before. My partner and I watched the movie Us, which I've already seen, but he hadn't seen it. And I'm like, you got to see it. It's really good. And I went to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and Smedley's red safety vest was hanging on our coat rack. And I'm like, my doppelganger is coming for me. It's sufficiently scary. I enjoyed it quite a bit. It had a lot of interesting ideas.
Are you a horror movie person?
Not really. I'm very picky about horror movies. Okay, so the last time that we were here, we were talking about experiments. And the thing about experiments is that this is the only time that you can look at a cause-effect relationship, because we are actually manipulating a factor, our independent variable, and then we're going to see what happens to a variable that is our outcome. So if we think that texting will lead to worse driving in a driving simulator, what I should do is manipulate whether or not people text. And as we talked about last time, there are a couple of different ways that we can do this. We can divide people into groups and randomly assign some people to text and some people to not text. Another thing that we can do is we can have everybody be exposed to both experimental conditions. We can have people text on one session and then not text on the other, and we can compare their driving performance. So we can do it between groups or what we call within subjects. And either way, we should see that when you text, your driving performance in the simulator should get worse. So texting should be the only variable that affects driving ability. So as much as we possibly can, we want to make sure that any other factor like age, like gender, like driving ability, like intellectual capabilities, we need to make sure that those are not affecting driving performance. So there are a couple of different ways that we can do this. We can do this through random assignment. So we randomly assign people to conditions. I flip a coin. If it's heads, I say you're in the texting group. If it's tails, you say that you are in the non-texting group. So the idea is that as long as I have a large enough group size and I'm doing that random assignment, any of those differences like age, gender, driving ability, and so on should be equal between my groups. The other thing that we need to do is we need to exert what we call experimental control. We need to make sure as much as possible that environmental conditions are the same for all participants. So we treat all of our participants the same. We give them the exact same experimental instructions. Oftentimes my instructions will use computerized instructions that they have to read through. We do practice sessions so that everybody gets what they're supposed to do. So we treat everybody the same. Now, sometimes when we're exerting experimental control, treating everybody the same does not look the way that you would expect it to. So here's kind of an example. So when I was in graduate school, I actually did a lot of work with older adults. I studied something called cognitive aging. So we were looking at how things like memory and attention and problem solving change from young adulthood into older adulthood. So here's the thing. You don't want to treat in terms of treating people the same. Here's something that you need to know, and we'll talk about this more in the next chapter when we talk about sleep. What time do your grandparents tend to get up in the morning?
5 a.m.
Really early. I remember when I would visit my grandparents and I would have to sleep on a mattress in the living room floor. My grandfather would shuffle into the living room around 4:30 or 5 in the morning, and he'd start watching real stories of the Highway Patrol. So your circadian rhythm, your sleep-wake cycle shifts as you get older. So shockingly enough, y'all are kind of shifting from adolescence into adulthood. You need a lot of sleep. What time of day are you going to be at your cognitive best? What time are you going to be at your cognitive best? Like in terms of your skills, when are you sharpest? Anybody want to answer? Yeah, Luca.
11 p.m.
11 p.m. So some of you are night owls. Yeah.
I am not a night owl.
Okay. But when
So-
are you your best?
It's hard to say. I front load all of my classes on purpose
Okay.
as much as possible though. And then I try to get my work done right after class. So I would say like not first in the morning. 'Cause then I have to
Late
get-
morning, early afternoon?
Yeah.
How many of you kind of feel that way? Like, let's forget when you're tired after lunch. How about late morning into the afternoon? Is that when most of you are? Okay, so it turns out that for older adults, their cognitive peak is at like 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. Would y'all want to come in and do a study at that time? No. If I involved your grandparents in a study, would you want me bringing them in at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon? No, they'd be too tired at that point. Y'all, there's a reason the early bird special starts at 4:30 in the afternoon. That's why they call it the early bird special. But kind of my point, treating everyone the same and testing everybody at the same time, in this case, puts everybody at a disadvantage. So if we want to treat everybody the same here, when we know that there are documented differences, we're going to test people at the time that's best for them. So when I would do cognitive aging studies, I would have to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I was like a little bit older than you. I was about 22 or 23. I would get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, head over to the lab, prepare for the older adults to come in, run them at like 8 or 9 in the morning. They were done by 10 or 11, and then 1 or 2 run the college students. That's what treating everybody the same sometimes looks like. Just as a fun little addition. Okay, so I am going to pause sharing here because I'm about to show copyrighted material. And even though I'm not monetized, I don't want to get claimed. So for those of you that are watching this on video, I will be right back. Okay. Because we're talking about neuroscience in the brain, so I feel like I have to show you this before. Oh, I need to pause recording. Okay. More. Pause. And
Are we gonna have to memorize all that?
no. That's for biopsych.
Must memorize the song.
Oh no, don't memorize the song either. Don't memorize the song either. All right, here we go. Okay. So, welcome to our study of brain and behavior. We are now moving on to chapter 2. Chapter 2, so I gotta say, y'all, chapter 2 is a really weird chapter because they combine a bunch of different things together. They combine a discussion of the nervous system and an introduction to the nervous system. They cover sleep, they cover attention, they cover consciousness, and all of that good stuff. Yeah.
I was skimming and I did notice the sleep section, and I was like kind of wondering why that was also in the like brain chapter.
Well, because
But
we're
I was
also
just skimming.
so we're talking about the brain and consciousness here, and we don't exactly know why conscious awareness happens. So when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about what you are aware of at this moment in time. And the thing is, we don't exactly know how it happens. We know that it makes us special. And at least as far as we know, most animals do not have that sense of awareness, although some do. It's complicated, but we believe that it is our brain, this thing, that allows that consciousness to happen. Also, I don't think they could find a good place for the rest of it, so they just put it there.
So does that mean that there's not a like separate brain section? Like that's all I'm gonna get in that textbook probably?
This is all you're gonna get, but I teach biopsychology. I do teach a course in biopsychology, so you will be absolutely set. And that is going to be a little tougher. You just throwing things.
Yeah.
You're just throwing things. I can't believe you. I do teach a course in biopsychology. In our department, I am the person that by and large teaches the biological psychology courses. So if you are interested in learning more at any given semester, there will be a class available for you. So here are the classes that I teach. They are not all going to be offered next semester, but I am teaching biopsych next semester. I also teach courses in sensation and perception, drugs and behavior, and I'm also teaching a new course in brain imaging techniques, which will probably be introduced next year. And we'll get to play with this. This is my EEG cap. We are not going to toy around with it too much because it is very expensive. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about today. And while you're writing this down, I forgot I did have one more announcement for you. If you have looked around the building, there are some flyers about a group that we have that is called SOAR. It stands for Students Off and Running. And in that class, it's not really a class, but we're a group that meets maybe once or twice a month. It's run by Heather English and myself. And we want to help students make that transition from high school to college. So if you want to learn more things about note-taking, time management, if you're a first-generation college student and you're a little confused, or if you want to learn more about that how to college thing, you can come even if you're not a first-gen student. We'd still love to have you. We are having our first session on September 14th at 7 o'clock. So that is not next Wednesday, but the following Wednesday. So I wanted to kind of put that on your radar if you were interested. Yeah.
What time is it again?
7 o'clock, Wednesday, September 14th. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about with respect to the brain. So we're going to talk about the nervous system and the role that it plays in behavior. And folks, your nervous system does not just include your brain. It also includes your spinal cord and all of the nerves that branch out from the spinal cord that help you sense things and help you move your body. We're going to talk about how the different parts of the brain function. Now, I was asked, are you going to be asked to memorize parts of the brain? No, I am not going to point to a brain and be like, hey, what's this? That's for biopsych occasionally. But I do expect you to have a pretty good idea of the function of parts. I am not going to talk about every part of the brain. But if I talk about one and I tell you what it's responsible for, you should have a pretty good idea. We're going to talk about how the brain affects the body. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about the role that nature plays, what you're born with, your genetics, your brain structure. And we're going to talk about that, how that interacts with nature, our environment. Bless you. That was the cutest sneeze I've ever heard. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to draw attention to it. That was really cute though. Oh, hey, if it makes you feel any better, the first year that I was here, I had a set of identical twins. They were in, so I taught 2 sections of general psychology. They were in different sections. Both of them, I am not kidding, would sneeze 7 times in a row. Achoo, 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 achoo. And I'm like, your sister does the exact same thing in my other class.
My brother says, like once he sneezes once, he probably only gets to sneeze once, but he can't do it like less than 4 times.
I have one. Hello, this is Mr. Neuron. I'm going to pass him around in a little bit so you can have some good luck. Give him a squeeze for good luck this year. So we're going to start by talking about how the brain affects behavior. So when we're talking about the relationship between brain and behavior and mental states, we are now kind of shifting gears. Remember that I told you we're going to be jumping around from subfield to subfield to subfield. We're starting at the simplest part, because everything that you do originates from brain activity. So we're going to start with biopsychology. Biopsychology examines how our nervous system influences our mental activity and behavior. Now, some of you are like, Dr. Gilchrist, I'm so disappointed. I came to this class to learn about people, and you're teaching me about the brain. What are you doing? Well, to really put it into perspective, you're a walking brain on legs. When it really comes down to it, your brain is responsible for your mental activity and behavior. Your brain has different mechanisms that enable your body to interact with the world around you and with the people around you. And it also enables you to think. Now, this is a philosophical idea that is known as monism. So we talk about the mind, the mental activities that we do, and we talk about the brain. If you are a monist, you believe that the things that your brain does create those mental processes. So your mental processes are a product of your brain. Now, there are some people out there, and I do not judge, that are known as dualists. They believe that your mind and the mental activities that it does is a separate thing from your brain. So dualist means that they are separate substances. If you are in psychology, by and large, you believe that the mental processes that are going on are a product of your brain. So if I stimulated a part of your brain, you would potentially feel a sensation that was not necessarily in your environment. So yeah, that gets into the whole, you could just be a brain in a jar. It could be like the Matrix. Folks, you're real. This is not the Matrix. Although in the Matrix, they had really cool
One
clothes.
day the rats will take over and just start poking things in our brain like Ratatouille, and we'll be like, popping
No, that's the worst idea.
Be really good at cooking.
Why would the rats want to do that to us?
Ratatouille. Yeah. Have you ever seen Ratatouille?
Of course. Okay. So your nervous system has three major functions. First of all, you are going to get information from your senses. So if I touch a cup of hot coffee and I hold it in my hand and that mug is too hot, information from nerves in my fingertips and in my hand are going to be sent to my brain, and they're going to say, whoa, that's too hot, pull your hand away. So you're going to get information from your senses. That includes the things you see, the things you hear, the things you touch, the things you taste, the things you smell, your position in space, your motion in the world, and things like that. So your brain is going to get that information from your body. The nervous system will then try to process that information and try to make sense of it. And then finally, once it processes that information, it's going to send messages to your body to act on that information. So sensory information is sent to our brain processes it, then our brain sends commands to our motor system to allow us to act. So for example, I am feeling a dryness in my mouth. My brain is saying, Dr. Gilchrist, you're thirsty. So now my brain is sending a message to my arm to reach for my drink so I can have some cherry bubbly. Huh?
Sounds so good right now.
Cherry bubbly is good. I have a white peach ginger bubbly in my office. I also have a Diet Mountain Dew in my bag.
Yeah.
That comes later. Okay. So don't write this down. You are going to see this again and again. If you would rather, take a picture of it with your phone. And also, this is being recorded. You can look at this later on YouTube. Because I'm going to post it through my YouTube channel. So the nervous system has a couple of different major divisions. So we have two different nervous systems. We have the peripheral nervous system and we have the central nervous system. Now I'm going to talk about the central nervous system here first because it's easier. It's basically your brain and your spinal cord. Now, how do we know the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system? Your central nervous system is protected by bones. So what's protecting your brain? Your skull, which by the way, is actually made up of separate bones. So we have the bones of the skull. We also have a lot of cerebrospinal fluid, and we have some thick membranes known as the meninges. You do not need to write that down. That is for your enrichment. What protects our spinal cord? Your spinal column, the spinal vertebrae. So those are really important. So they need to be protected by bones. Now, branching out from the brain and the spinal cord, we have things that are part of our peripheral nervous system. They are made up of nerves. Nerves are not protected. So sometimes they get damaged, but they can repair themselves. So here's something that's really important. Sometimes when your nerves are damaged, they can repair themselves. So if you burn your finger or you burn your tongue, You're going to have some damage sensation there. Like if you're like me, you get pizza, you're like, ooh, it's fresh. Ow, I burned the roof of my mouth and my tongue with hot cheese. And I've never gotten better at that. I'm a glutton for punishment, but your nerves are going to repair themselves. But if you damage a neuron in your brain, if you damage something in your spinal cord, your neurons cannot repair themselves. That's why they need to be protected. So your peripheral nervous system is capable of occasionally regenerating. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Nerves in your ears and your eyes don't necessarily regenerate, but if we're talking about nerves in the skin, they can. Now, the peripheral nervous system can be broken down into two different branches. So we have what is called the autonomic nervous system. Now, another way to think about the autonomic nervous system is to think about automatic. So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for automatic functions. So it's for self-regulated actions of your organs and your glands. So for example, are you breathing right now? You absolutely are. Do you know how I know that? Because you're not dead. You're breathing right now and your heart is beating. Now, can you consciously control your breathing? Absolutely. I do it all the time. But are you always keeping an eye on your breathing? No. Are you always keeping an eye on your heart rate? Absolutely not. Your autonomic nervous system is doing all of that for you. It's responsible for things like digestion, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your glucose metabolism. It controls all of that. We can break the autonomic nervous system down into two more branches. So we have what is called our sympathetic nervous system. This is designed for giving us energy. You may know of it as our fight or flight system. So this system is designed to give your body the energy that it needs to either fight stress or something that is challenging or flee from it. Yeah, Abby.
Would this also include freezing?
Yes, freezing is a part of that, for sure. Now, if we're talking in terms of like long-term responses to trauma, it turns out there are actually 4, but they're not really under the purview of the sympathetic nervous system. You have fight, flee, freeze, and fawn. People pleasing, people pleasing, people pleasing. I might actually know something about that. But that's not really a sympathetic nervous system response. That is a learned response that is a survival mechanism based on environmental experience. Now, your body cannot constantly, like your sympathetic nervous system requires a lot of energy, and you are not going to be able to sustain that energy for a long period of time. So you have what is called your parasympathetic nervous system, which is designed to calm you down and help you conserve that energy. So whereas the sympathetic nervous system is sometimes referred to as fight or flight, you can think of your parasympathetic nervous system as your rest and digest system. So we have to talk about the other branch of the peripheral nervous system. Now that we've talked about the autonomic nervous system, this is referred to as either the skeletal nervous system. Another word that we use is, I will say one thing I like about Zoom is annotate. Another word for the skeletal nervous system is the somatic nervous system. This is responsible for voluntary movements of the body. So should I decide to do the robot, that is my skeletal nervous system in play. So it controls the voluntary movements of your skeletal system and your muscles. All right, we are going to go into this in a little bit more detail, but I've given you kind of the Clips Notes version. And I probably went into more detail here than I needed to, So we'll kind of keep the others shorter if it turns out that I've just been completely redundant, because that is possible. Okay. Okay. So we're going to start by talking about neurons. So if we want to get to those major divisions of the nervous system, we have to talk about our friend, the neuron. This is a specialized animal cell that is designed to communicate with other cells. You have about 86 billion neurons, give or take. And as the cognitive psychology class learned on Wednesday, your brain and nervous system in general, you have about 860 trillion different connections between neurons. They are designed to communicate with each other. They are designed to connect with each other. So neurons will communicate selectively with other neurons. They form communication networks, and they form these networks through experience. So the more that you learn, the more that your networks grow and neurons will build connections. So here's something kind of interesting that you may not know. You're pretty much born with almost all of the neurons that you're ever going to have when you are an infant. But you're like, Dr. Gilchrist, my head is bigger now. My brain is bigger now. Yes, yes, it is. Do you know why your brain got bigger? Not because you grew more neurons, but because they all started forming connections with each other. You built those connections through learning and experience. Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't we end up at some point getting like a lot more neurons that we need, and part of the process is like paring those down?
So we never actually grow more neurons. Now, some people will tell you that you can't grow new neurons in adulthood. You can, but you're certainly not going to grow them on the level that you did when you were younger. So the thing is that, yeah, it's not so much that you have more neurons than you need. Your neurons are precious. It's that when you're young, especially between the ages of 3 and 7, that's when you're doing your most growth. You're actually going to build more connections than you actually need. And at that point, your brain is going to start figuring out what connections it needs and which ones it doesn't. And those get what are called pruned. Hey, by the way, fun fact, you don't need to write this down. It's just for your enrichment and also because I think it's cute. So one of the things that we're going to find is we often talk about neurons in terms of trees. The process of growing new connections and branching out to form connections with neurons is what is called arborization. You're forming more trees. So because of neurons, you're capable of learning, you are remembering, and you are growing. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be a huge dork here. So I first started learning about these connections when I was about your age. Maybe I was a sophomore in college. And one of the coolest things that I thought was that every time you learn something new, every time that you learn a habit or you learn to change your behavior in some way, your brain is technically becoming a new thing by building a new connection. So every time that you learn something, your brain becomes a brand new thing. Your brain is not the same as it was the day before. I think that's really neat. Okay, so let's send Mr. Neuron out into the audience. I will not throw. So go ahead and pass Mr. Neuron around and make sure I get him back. He's kind of my lucky thing. He got me through grad school, y'all. Grad school was hard. So what you're looking at here, and you can kind of see that the plushie is definitely not a perfect replica of a neuron, but it's pretty darn close. So here's what neurons look like. Yeah.
You need to draw that.
You don't need to draw it here.
Maybe just
You might need to draw it for a test, which is coming up at the end of the month. Maybe. So you don't have to draw it now, but if you want to go back and watch this in the video, I would do that or take a picture with your phone. So I mentioned that neurons are specialized animal cells, and they are. So what you're looking at here is what is called the cell body of the neuron. Now, another name that we sometimes use for the cell body of soma. So we sometimes call our cell body the soma. The soma contains all of the information that you would find in any other animal cell. So it has an endoplasmic reticulum, it has mitochondria, which is what, y'all? Powerhouse of the cell. It has a nucleus with DNA and chromosomes and genes. So it has everything that is needed to have this animal cell run. Now, what's different about neurons is that they have additional structures that allow for connections to be built and for communication with things like muscles, organs, glands, and other neurons to happen. So branching out from the soma are these little tree structures. These tree structures are called dendrites. And yes, folks, dendrite means tree. So the goal of a dendrite is to receive messages from other cells. So it's going to receive messages from other cells. So on the surface of these dendrites are all of these little places where neurotransmitters can come and send messages. So sometimes a little molecule of serotonin will attach to a dendrite, or epinephrine, or dopamine, or things like that. So those are where messages are sent. The dendrites are going to pick up those messages. Now, branching off from the soma, we have what is called the axon. So you only have one axon. And this axon is basically, once this information has been received by the dendrites, the soma is going to process that information, and it's basically going to decide whether or not it wants to fire based on the message that it gets. If it does decide to fire, it's going to pass a message down the axon all the way to the end of the axon at an area called the terminal branches, or the terminal buttons. Now, a couple of things I'll mention about the axon. The message that is being sent within the neuron. So this little message is electrical in nature. So we call this the neural impulse. It goes in one direction, so it goes from the soma down to the terminal branches. It does not go backwards, and it does not degrade. So it doesn't weaken. So we have some really long axons in our body. Some of the longest ones that we have are the nerves that run from the spinal cord down to your feet. It's part of the reason why when you stub your toe, it takes you a little while to be like, oh, hey, that hurt. But even with those really long lengths of axon, the signal does not degrade. We will talk about why that is in biopsych if you take it, but not here. Just know that it doesn't degrade. So the neural impulse is going to go all the way down to the terminal branches. The terminal branches will then release chemicals that will be picked up by the dendrites of other cells. So the message that is being sent by a neuron is electrochemical in nature. So within the same neuron, it's electrical, but when we start passing that message to other neurons, it's chemical. Now, one other thing that I will mention, you'll notice that this particular axon is covered with what look like beads. Those are actually fat. Your brain needs a little bit of fat, and this is what is called a myelin sheath. This is a fatty substance that actually speeds up the neural impulse. Has anybody heard of a disorder known as multiple sclerosis? Bless you. Multiple sclerosis happens. It's a neurodegenerative disease where the nerves and the axons lose their myelin. So they progressively lose their myelin, which means that the neural impulse begins to slow down, and that can cause a lot of problems. Does anybody have any questions about this? It's okay if you do.
Then yes.
Okay.
First off, how did we figure out the shape of a neuron?
We had somebody look at it through a microscope. So the first person to really look at this, so here's something kind of interesting. We didn't really know what neurons were until the late 1800s, early 1900s, and here's why. Now normally, if you wanted to look at animal cells in the body, it's pretty straightforward. You get a sample, you get a stain, and you look at them under a microscope. Easy peasy. So it turns out that neurons are kind of interesting. When you take a sample of brain tissue and you stain it, the entire sample gets stained. So what we actually found is that there were people back in the 1900s that believed that the brain was not made up of cells, that it was what was called a reticulum. It was basically this weird, meshy webwork of stuff. So the first person to really find that it was made of cells was somebody, and you don't need to write this down, this is for your enrichment, Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He won the Nobel Prize for this work. He found that if you use a silver Golgi stain, here's what's kind of weird about a Golgi stain. It doesn't stain all of the cells. It selectively stains them. So when he applied this silver nitrate stain to brain tissue, it selectively stained some of the cells, and you could actually see their structure. Now, what's really wild is that when he won this award, other people, even after he made this discovery, were still saying the brain is not made up of cells. It's a random meshwork of stuff. So this is actually a relatively new discovery, given that cell theory has been around since like the 1700s.
And then my second question, which hopefully won't take too long, is like in terms of figuring out how the dendrites work and how electrical signals are passed, how did we do those experiments to figure that out?
I'm going to talk about that later.
Okay.
The answer involves a giant squid.
That's exciting.
Yes.
I have a question, but it's not really related to the neuron.
Okay, how about you ask it and I'll figure out if we can answer it now or if you could ask me after class.
Cool. Is there a difference between dopamine and serotonin?
Yes, we'll talk about that. We'll get there. All right, clear all annotation, clear all drawings. There we go. Okay, so when we look at the inside and outside of a neuron, so this is going to answer Savannah's question. So the neuron actually has some really interesting electrical properties. We know this through the work of Hodgkins and Huxley, who actually studied the electrical properties of neurons by looking at giant squid neurons. Now, why would you want to look at the neuron of a giant squid? Here's the really easy answer. You can actually see the cells with your own eyes. So they are visible to the naked eye, unlike your brain cells. So they were able to actually test the inside of the cell relative to the outside of the cell. So the neuron is actually covered with a semi-permeable membrane. What this means is that some things are allowed to enter the cell and other things are not. So it's selective as to what it will allow. Now, here's what we know. And I'm going to keep this pretty brief, but if you take biopsych, we are going to go over this in a lot of detail. Relative to the outside of the cell, so at rest, your cells actually carry a negative electrical charge. That charge is about -70 millivolts. So the cell is more negative on the inside and it's more positive on the outside. And that's because of the structure of ions that occur inside and outside of the cell. So inside of the cell, there is more potassium, there is more chlorine, and there's more negatively charged organic ions that contribute to that negative charge. Outside of the cell, we actually have more sodium. And y'all, sodium really wants to get into that cell because sodium carries a positive charge. The inside of the cell carries a negative charge, and opposites attract. But the problem is that at rest, sodium cannot get inside the cell. It is selectively closed at that point. It's like the club's not open and the bouncer's not going to let you in. So when a neuron decides to fire, that's when action potentials talk to each other. So if there is enough stimulation that could occur inside, so if you're stressed out about something, if I provide a stimulus that is sufficiently noticeable, you're going to get an action potential. So basically what happens is that with sufficient stimulation, the cell becomes less negative, which allows sodium to enter. So what's really interesting is that for a very short period of time, as that electrical impulse is occurring, the cell's voltage actually shifts from negative to briefly being positive. It actually goes up to about 40 millivolts. That's positive during the peak of the action potential. So there are 3 different phases of how neurons talk to each other. So we have transmission, we have reception, and we have integration. So transmission occurs when the neuron is receiving different chemical messages from other neurons. So it's going to be transmitted. The neuron receives that and then integrates all of the messages to basically decide to fire. So your book kind of talks about it this way. So we're trying to figure out if we should have a party. So imagine that we're a giant neuron and you are all a bunch of messages from other neurons. So some of you want there to be a party. You're a party animal. So you want to excite the neuron. Some of you are party poopers. You want to bring a book to a party and you want to inhibit the neuron. Now, during the process of integration, we're trying to figure out if we've got more party poopers or if we have more party animals. If there are more, and your book basically phrases it like this: if there's more party animals than party poopers, party's on. Action potential fires. If there's more party poopers, they are designed to be inhibitory, you will not get an action potential. So it's all about summing all of the different messages together. If the neuron reaches a threshold and is already a little less negative than it was, the action potential will begin. So we'll talk about this more next time. Y'all, don't forget your forum posts. They're due today at 5. If you've posted your forum post and I haven't graded it yet, I graded a bunch yesterday, but if you haven't, if it hasn't been graded yet, I will get to it this afternoon. All right, have a wonderful weekend. I will see you here on Wednesday. Happy Labor Day. Don't come to class on Monday because I won't be here. Bye, everybody.
Why are squid big?
Because giant squids are big. Giant squids are big.